South Africa's inflation rate is at its highest in over 5 years. Data from Stats SA shows the consumer price index, which measures the rate at which prices change, rose by an annual pace of 6.5% in May. The main contributors to the annual inflation rate included transport, food and non-alcoholic beverages, housing and utilities. The highest rate of increases were recorded in the oil and fats food category, followed by electricity and other fuels. Following months of notable increases in the fuel price, the price of petrol decreased by 12 cents per litre in May, but the price of diesel further increased by 98 cents per litre in the month. Consumer inflation has now breached the Reserve Bank's upper range of the target bracket of 6%. This will likely translate into a hefty interest rate hike as the central bank strives to rein in inflation. Indebted consumers will feel the pinch as they deal with the general increase in the cost of living. Well, earlier I did speak to Elna Moolman. She's an economist at Standard Bank about the inflation number.
I think what is important is that if we unpack this data a little bit, then like you've mentioned, the headline inflation, significantly higher than we expected and up significantly from previous months. But if we look at core inflation, which strips out just those two elements, in other words, food and energy prices, then that is still sitting at 4.1%. In other words, the rest of the inflation basket is still reasonably subdued. Now, what we're seeing in food and fuel prices is really just the direct impact of the spikes in global prices. If we look at the food price element here specifically, then it was grain prices and oil product prices. And again, that really just is imported inflation from abroad. But our domestic part of the basket, and the part that is driven by domestic demand and sensitive to how strong demand is, remain very low, as I've mentioned, 4.1%. Or if we unpack it a little bit differently, then services inflation, again, that is often influenced more by the strength of domestic demand, is sitting at just 3.6%. So this is really a case of food and fuel prices driving the inflation rate.
Yeah, I know July is going to be the key month, but what about administration or administrative fee increases, in terms of what the municipalities charge us and so on and so forth? How much of a driver is that going to be in the inflation number?
Yes, that's definitely also going to play a role in the next few months. We have seen in recent years slightly smaller increases at the municipal level. In other words, there were years when that was really a dominating force behind the inflation pressure. We have seen municipalities trying to limit those increases, but of course their costs are also rising and therefore they have to pass that on. You've already mentioned the electricity price increase that is still coming, and then of course we've had some fuel levy relief that will be unwound in the next couple of months. So a couple of very specific inflation pressures still lying ahead for consumers.
So, Elna, it would seem that there's more upward momentum to come with inflation, especially when you explain to us that it's really exogenous forces that are continuing to push up inflation. What does this then mean for poorer sections of our community? And could the middle class, as we know it, start to change or substantially reduce?
Yes, so it's undoubtedly having a very strong and negative impact at the lower and middle income groups. We, of course, keep in mind that for the lower income groups, they have at least some relief in the form of the social grants that were extended in the budget, and that will probably become a permanent feature. So they have some relief, but of course they're obviously a lot worse off than they were a couple of months ago, because this is then eating into the spending power that they have with those reasonably small income grants.
You did say that you think that extra benefit that the SRD recipients have been getting, well, in actual fact, they haven't been getting that benefit for the past 2 months. There's been a backlog, but assuming that they do continue to get it, you said it in a very by-the-way type of way. Do you believe that this is going to be an ongoing feature and that the fiscus is going to have to be committed to a minimum at least of 350 Rand, especially in the environment that we're in with higher inflation and so on?
Absolutely. So at this stage, of course, it hasn't been officially announced and incorporated in the budget numbers, but there's no doubt in my mind that it will become a permanent feature. And on the one hand, that means that somewhere we still have to find a way of funding that. At the same time, it also means that we probably know more or less what we're dealing with from a fiscal perspective. In other words, we're probably talking about tweaking that grant, perhaps extending it to slightly more beneficiaries, but we're talking about that rather than the basic income grant. The one positive that I wanted to mention in the context of your earlier question around the middle income class is that we're reasonably constructive about the outlook for employment. So at this stage, all of these pressures are, of course, eating into the spending power of your income.
Yeah.
But we think that you've had 2 years of economic recovery. You haven't seen any recovery in private sector full-time employment. And we think that we're at the point now where that will start to catch up. So that is the one positive that we can highlight over the next, let's say, 6 to 12 months from a general consumer perspective.
Do you have anything positive to say about what the Reserve Bank's next move will be in July?
I think it has already been inevitable that we'll get at least another 50 basis point hike. I think there will be perhaps a debate about whether it should be 50 or 75. We have seen an acceleration in the pace of interest rate hikes elsewhere in the world. I still think the SARB is in the fortunate position that they were preemptive last year when they started hiking before it was really necessary. And recently, of course, they stepped up that increment of the rate hikes before it was absolutely necessary. So because they started early, I still think that they'd be able to be reasonably gradual. In other words, I still think the 50 basis points that we were expecting in July remains a 50 basis point, and that we won't get a shock in the form of bigger increments. I do think what the data implies is that the risk has increased, that the rate hikes will be more front-loaded. In other words, just doing what they were going to do a little bit quicker.